Available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Fantasy Sports Network. Hope you guys have enjoyed this episode thus far. I really love talking about this NFC West division. But we are going to continue with a switch from Arizona to Los Angeles. We're going to do another quarterback, a guy who I don't necessarily think gets the respect he often deserves. And that guy is Matthew Stafford. I really believe that Matthew Stafford is someone who's a special player in this league. A guy who I really think people need to respect in fantasy. Obviously, he's not the sexiest option, mainly due to the fact he's reliant on short to intermediate routes, and he's not necessarily the prettiest in terms of yards per game or yards in a season. But Matthew Stafford certainly has some merit and holds some weight in the fantasy world. So without further ado, let's jump into why I think that is. Throughout his career, both as a Ram and as a Lion, he's accumulated 3,484.6 fantasy points in his career. His best season was in 2021, his first season as a Ram, his Super Bowl winning season, where he had 329.74 fantasy points. Last year, you saw this level of consistency that I was talking about. He averaged 264.3 pass yards, 1.6 TD passes, and 16.9 fantasy points per game. Those are very solid numbers, and they are projecting him to have that nice number yet again. 4,103 yards through the air, 25 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, and a total of 259.1 fantasy points. Last year, he was also 18th in fantasy points per game, so as you can see, he's always going to be that consistent level. He's not going to drop too low or go up too high. He's always going to remain kind of in that middle ground, just where you would want him to be if you were considering him in fantasy. Now, here's the thing about Matthew Stafford that I really like about him. No matter in whatever offensive system he is, no matter what skill position players he has, no matter how big the names are at wide receiver, Matthew Stafford is always himself. He commands the respect of the locker room. He commands the respect of his offense just by being a steady presence who never gets too hyper-focused on one thing. He's always calm and composed, and we see it in his play. And we saw it especially last year when it was a really trying time for the LA Rams. And they made something of it. They turned lemons into lemonade. They lost Cooper Kupp for most of the year, and they were wondering who was going to step up to claim that wide receiver 1 spot for the time being. They ultimately found a new wide receiver 1 in Puka Nacua, and that's all down to Matthew Stafford just trusting and relying on these players around him to perform, and that's what a great quarterback does. In terms of fantasy, Matthew Stafford, I'm not saying he's the best things in sliced bread. I'm just saying that if you're looking for someone who is always going to be consistent, who's always going to be reliable, but might not be pretty doing it, it's Matthew Stafford. And there's something to be said about no matter what age you are, no matter which team you're on, no matter what your offense looks like, you're able to make something out of any situation. Matthew Stafford stepped onto this volatile Rams team that was looking for success, and he immediately gave it to them. And so, while he certainly hasn't been the biggest thing about the Los Angeles Rams as they've continued to improve as a team, he's certainly been someone who's not necessarily hindering their growth. He's not hurting it at the time being. Not to say that there's not an opportunity where he could hurt them, but right now, Matthew Stafford is doing everything he can to sustain the success of the Los Angeles Rams and make them a contender in not only the NFC West, but also in the entirety of the NFC and the NFL. So, I would love to say that Matthew Stafford is someone who could be a QB1 still, but that's not the reality of it. The caveat to all of this in Matthew Stafford is the fact that he is getting up there in age, and injuries might derail him. We saw last year there were a couple of injuries he had to worry about, along with so many throughout his Lions career as well. So while he has been consistent in terms of production, he's also been consistently getting injured. And so being able to stay healthy and fully fit is a detriment in terms of fantasy for him because he's not always reliably healthy. And so as a result, that's probably why a lot of you are skeptical in the first place. Also, I think that at some point in time, Sean McVay's way of playing offense will have to stagnate. I think that ultimately teams are going to be more savvy to how the Rams play football. And I think that as the years go by, no matter if Matthew Stafford is the quarterback, this may even be his last year as an LA Ram and in the NFL. We'll have to see. But as the years go on, there has to come a point in time where teams get wary of and savvy to what Sean McVay is doing on offense. Because right now, they have the benefit of the doubt that Sean McVay is still savvy enough to get the best out of his players and create an offensive scheme that's tough to break down. Now, looking at how they did last year, I think a lot of their success stemmed from their ability to spread people out. You had guys like Kyren Williams, who I'm going to talk about next, in the backfield. You had a guy in Puka Nacua who was just a very savvy route runner. You had Cooper Kupp coming back later in the year. So you had these guys who really were able to understand their roles in this offense. Now, I think that power dynamic is changing. When I look at the Rams, I can't necessarily say Cooper Kupp is now their top wide receiver. I think Puka Nacua has to be. And that could certainly change a lot of the ways Sean McVay decides to scheme things. You obviously don't necessarily have a wide receiver 3. Maybe it's DeMarcus Robinson, someone like that. Maybe Tyler Higbee can also be very volatile in how he plays. But when I look at this Rams offense, the one thing that scares me is Sean McVay, and it's not any other skill position players. The way Sean McVay and Matthew Stafford trust each other, most importantly, is another reason why I think this Rams offense is so feared. And when I look at that connection above anyone else on the Los Angeles Rams, I see two guys who view offense very differently from each other. I think Matthew Stafford just wants tempo, and Sean McVay wants pace. And ultimately, those connections combine very well together when you look at it in hindsight. And so that's the reason why the Rams offense has been as prolific as it's been in the Matthew Stafford era of it, mainly due to the fact that Matthew Stafford and Sean McVay can adapt to each other so well. Now, the one thing I really like about any fantasy quarterback who has a fantastic season is the fact that they have someone to rely on at the wide receiver position. Every good fantasy QB should have a fantasy wide receiver who also performs and exceeds expectations. And right now, Puka Nacua, I'm looking at him, I'm looking at his rookie season, I'm looking at how impressive he was, but I'm also looking at if he can truly replicate that, because this Rams offense, when it's hot, relies on so many things. It doesn't necessarily rely on Puka Nacua to always be open. It can rely on the space that guys like Kyren Williams and Cam Akers creates. It relies on Tyler Higbee also being a savvy route runner. It relies on Cooper Kupp combining all of his incredible traits. And so, the one caveat with this whole Matthew Stafford situation is the fact that at some points I kind of feel like he'll play out of structure, and that's what would muddle this Rams offense. We see it in how kind of tries to push Sean McVay's philosophy vicariously through the team, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily work. And so I feel like if Matthew Stafford plays more relaxed this year, A, it helps his longevity, and B, it also helps him gain more respect in fantasy circles. But as of right now, I can't say Matthew Stafford is anything more than a consistent, serviceable quarterback. I would love to say that Matthew Stafford is not only the best quarterback in the NFC West, but also in most of the NFC, if not the entirety of the NFC. But I definitely do think he should get more respect. I'm not saying you should overvalue him or undervalue him. I'm just saying that Matthew Stafford is certainly a player who kind of falls by the wayside when we think about fantasy. Next season is going to be very pivotal for him. I think that if he plays freely, then he's primed for a big year. But if he plays a little bit more tense within the system, I think he could unravel very quickly. But that should just about do it for this segment of the day's show. Tune in for the last segment of today's show where we go over Matthew Stafford's backfield running mate and Kyren Williams as we close out the show on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.